All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Business of Biotech series this week. This month, we're doing the regulatory process for drug development and trends in life science fundings and exits. Our two presenters are going to be, let's see how this goes. Enter. I don't know how to advance slides on the computer. There we go. All right. Our presenters are Marcia Dougan-Moore. She's the Vice President of Development Operations at Arvinas, and Tim Shannon, a partner at Canaan Partners. They'll be, we're going to do two 30-minute sessions, two 30-minute presentations from each of them, and then a 30-minute Q&A that, open to the whole audience. But don't be afraid to jump in during the presentations if you have specific questions about what they're talking about. So just talk about a little about who we are and what this series is. The whole point here is to kind of connect the academic researchers and the scientists here at Yale and at other universities with the broader biotech environment in the Connecticut area. So we want to build a foundation for the researchers. We want to bring in that community. We want to just bridge the gap, bring everybody together. For the events that are upcoming, so this month, obviously, we're doing the regulatory climate, but in February, we're going to be talking about how exactly you bring a clinical trial to market. In March, we're going to do bridging the valley of death. So these are the new models for developing breakthrough discoveries into medicines. It's this, the classic problem of you have a great idea in the lab, but how do you get a business model behind it so you can bring it to market? And then the last session in the series is going to be on biomedical devices and healthcare IT, the big exploding field these days. And just to say who we are, we're led by Mary. She's in the front here, and Rob on the side there. Rob? Okay, thanks. Andrew in the back, and then our Ericas couldn't be here today, but I think most of you know Erica Smith and Erica Hoyas Ramirez, who was helping me organize this event, but couldn't make it today. And then the last thing I want to do is just thank all of our sponsors. So we work with the YEI and the Blavatnik Fund, but we've gotten a lot of support from everybody here, from Lexion, from Canaan, from Jackson Labs, Cure, OCR, and the law firm WSGR. I'm not sure if I can remember all four partners' names. I'm sorry. But first things first, let me introduce our first speaker. Marcia has over 25 years of experience in the field. She's been doing business development for quite a few companies. You were at Bristol Myers Squibb, Alexion at one point, now Arvinas, and I'm missing one, aren't I? Okay, all right. But she's going to tell us a little bit about the basics of the regulatory process. Marcia? Thank you.
Oh, that's a good question.
Got it.
Let's see.
I'm not the only one that uses sticky notes on the computer.
I do. I get in trouble all the time.
No.
Hi, everybody. Sorry. There we go. So hi, thanks very much for inviting me back. I gave a similar presentation, I guess, last semester. So, sorry. So I appreciate the invitation to come back and speak. There we go. So I'm going to jump right in. I know that we don't have a lot of time together tonight, so just a couple of things about what I am going to talk about and what I'm not going to speak about. So I hope that at the end of this talk you'll have kind of a general overview and understanding of the drug development process and how the FDA interacts with sponsor companies to move through that process together. And it really is a collaborative process. My background in particular is in drug development, so I'm not going to speak about medical devices, which is really a completely different regulatory process. I will probably speak from my comfort zone, which is oncology, which is a little bit different than a lot of other areas, and I'm going to try to kind of speak more generally to other therapeutic areas as well. And I know Tim is going to be speaking about exit strategies and valuations. So what I'm going to ask you to do is kind of keep in mind how as molecules move through the development process and we learn more about them, we're actually de-risking them. And in doing so, that builds value. And that's going to kind of connect to what Tim's going to speak about in a few minutes. So let's start with the FDA. What does the FDA do? So they're required by law to review and evaluate and approve all drugs in the United States. It wasn't always that way. Back in the 1950s, and actually in the early 1960s, there was the drug which made the FDA famous, which was thalidomide, right? So thalidomide was approved for use in Europe. There was a woman at the FDA who was the assigned reviewer. She basically used loopholes in the process to delay the approval of thalidomide. Thalidomide, generally speaking, at that point in time, if you ran through the clock, you were automatically approved. There was no evaluation of safety, efficacy, or any sort of data. Subsequently, it was found that thalidomide did cause a number of different birth defects. This became the claim to fame of the FDA. And so now the regulations have changed such that you actually have to prove that not only is your drug safe, but that it works in the way that you say it works. Okay, so what is a new drug? And this is actually a definition that's a little bit surprising to some people. The first bullet point is somewhat obvious. If it's new, if it's never been given to people before, it's a new drug. The FDA also considers combinations of old drugs to be treated like a new drug. So anytime that we want to use things in a different way than they're originally approved, we have to go and go through this process again. If we want to use a drug outside of its labeled indication, if you want a new dosage form, or anything that's used as an in vitro diagnostic, something upon which diagnosis or treatment of a patient. So a lot of times you'll hear folks, especially in oncology, will talk about companion diagnostics. So in other words, if you have to have a particular biomarker on your tumor, there's a diagnostic test that will identify that. That goes through a regulatory process as well. So stepping back a little bit, we are a highly regulated industry. We're one of the most highly regulated industries in the world. Couple of just fun facts. It takes about 10 years, and the pharma will tell you that it takes a couple of $1 billion to move something from an idea and a concept all the way through to a regulatory approved agent. This is a slide which I shamelessly pilfered off the pharma website, but it's a very good visual about what happens and how many molecules are actually made to get one that becomes an approved medicine. So literally, as you work across the slide, there are thousands and thousands of molecules that start off at the beginning of that funnel. As you move into the preclinical phase, you're probably in the hundreds of molecules. Then there's an IND submission. You go through phase 1 through 3 clinical trials before an NDA submission. Then there's an FDA review of that data. And then there are post-marketing commitments that the agency requires. So it's really it's a stage-gated process, and we're going to talk a little bit about each of these steps, okay? So these are the basic steps that we go through. We start with an investigational new drug application, then we move to phase 1, 2, 3, the NDA, and of course our phase 4 and post-marketing. So what do we have? What's in an IND? What is it? An IND is basically a series of documents that we submit to the agency, and we're requesting permission to give an experimental agent to people. And the main thing that the agency is going to be concerned with is safety. That's their biggest concern. You need to tell them how you want to use it And that's because you're going to give them a protocol. So you're going to give them, if this is a first-in-man study, you're going to give them a protocol, and basically all of the other documentation that you provide is to support and justify that protocol. Okay? So what's in it? It's divided into 5 modules. The first one is administrative. They basically are looking for your name and address and who do they direct questions and hopefully not anything worse to. The second module is summary documents. So you can think about this section almost like you would the discussion section of a scientific paper, right? So this is where you as the sponsor can interpret some of the data that you're going to present in Module 4, which are the non-clinical study reports. You can talk to them about how this data comes together, how it supports your position, how it supports the mechanism of action, and why it is that you believe this is a good therapeutic for whatever patient population you're hoping to treat. Module 3 is largely what's referred to in the business as your chemistry, manufacturing, and control section. So as Colin alluded to, I've been in the business quite a bit. I'm a jack of all trades and a master of some, but my expertise is not in the CMC space. This is a very highly regulated area where you're looking at things like manufacturing, process development, controls, QA and QC, any deviations and CAPAs and things of that nature. So all of those documentations go into this particular section. So you've got to be able to tell the agency not only how you're making the active pharmaceutical ingredient, but also how you're making what we call the drug product. So what's the formulated material look like? What are the inactives? Module 4 are your non-clinical studies. So this is where you do all of your non-clinical pharmacology work. You're going to show some pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic activity, safety pharmacology, preclinical toxicology studies that are going to be done in 2 different species. And then further down the line, you will continue to add protocols to the same IND. So as you continue through development, if you move from phase 1 to phase 2, you're going to write a clinical study report for your phase 1 trial, and you're going to file that to your IND. So that closes out that particular study for the agency. Okay. So what does the FDA do when you submit that information? They basically have 30 days to review and either say that your IND is reasonably safe to proceed and you're allowed to go forward, or you can get a clinical hold. But in between that decision point, each of their subject matter expert reviewers may issue a set of questions. So this is a time as a sponsor where you want to know where every one of your people are. Because when the FDA asks a question, they also give you a timeline for an answer. And that timeline may be as short as 8 hours. If you don't reply in the time that they give you, you take a clock stop, which means that the 30-day clock stops when you reply and they view your reply, then they restart the clock. This makes your investors very unhappy. They do not like it when you take a clock stop. They want it to go smoothly. So generally speaking, they are not completely unreasonable with their time frames, but you do need to be on your game. Okay? So for a clinical hold, what would they say? They would say either it's a full clinical hold or a partial clinical hold. A full clinical hold means that if you have multiple protocols ongoing under your IND, they must all immediately stop, whatever you're doing. That's usually a big safety concern that the agency has, something probably unexpected. If it's a partial clinical hold, there's something with this particular protocol that they have a concern with. And what might those things be? Well, most likely it has something to do with the fact that they think that subjects or patients are going to be put at some sort of risk of injury. And they want some additional information to make them feel better about the study. They also may tell you that your investigators are not qualified. So the FDA does keep what they call a blacklist. It is a list of investigators that have been audited by the FDA and found to be lacking in terms of their compliance with either the regulations or good clinical practices. You cannot run a study with an investigator on a blacklist. They will not let you do it. The blacklist is available, and you can actually look it up online. So it is a legitimate thing. Hospitals with investigators that are blacklisted don't like to talk about it very much, and there's usually a large quality endeavor ongoing to correct those things. They may also find that your investigator brochure is not accurate. Your investigator brochure is basically probably a 40-page document that summarizes your IND. It talks about the drug, it talks about the safety. It is what the investigator and the investigator site and their IRB review with your protocol. It is also what the investigative site will use to generate an informed consent. So if your investigator brochure doesn't accurately reflect the safety information or certain aspects or risks related to your drug, it's very difficult for the site to come up with an appropriate informed consent. And the agency is highly sensitive to that. So patients enrolling on clinical trials do go through a fairly rigorous consent process. Okay? And finally, you can't really, it's very difficult to exclude genders from different studies. So there used to be that for breast cancer studies, companies only wanted to enroll women. There's a small percentage of men that also get breast cancer. You can't exclude them anymore. All right. So we've filed our IND. We did an excellent job. The FDA gave us a safe to proceed. We're doing a first-in-man study. What are we going to do next? We've got a phase 1 trial. So a phase 1 trial is typically a relatively small study. For most types of drugs in development, these studies are conducted in healthy volunteers. They are predominantly men. They cannot be women of childbearing potential. If your drug is expected to have some toxicities, so in oncology, for instance, we know that chemotherapeutic agents are not without their side effects. Those drugs are never tested in healthy volunteers. They're only tested in specific patient populations. So there are other drugs, anything that leads you to believe that there's some sort of a safety concern, then you'll go directly into patients. But these are very carefully controlled trials. How does it work with vaccines? I believe that vaccines can be used in people at risk. But the issues for the agency is a risk-benefit ratio. So if it's a vaccine for something that you're never going to be exposed to, the likelihood is low. If it's simply, let's go with the flu vaccine, which is kind of generic. That would be done in a healthy volunteer, right? They're looking to see if you can make antibodies. If it's a vaccine and it's for some obscure tropical virus, they're going to have to look at what the animal data support. If it appears as if there's absolutely no risk that you're really looking for an immune response, you may be able to get away with it in healthy volunteers. But it's one of those things that the agency looks at on a case-by-case basis. And they may actually ask you to go in one direction or another. So they may ask you to look for a patient population at risk. Or if you say we want to just use regular healthy volunteers, they may say that's all right too. I'm sorry. A pediatric track? Mm-hmm. So that's a big, it depends. So a lot of pediatric drugs are initially developed in adults. And then there's a completely different program that's developed around pediatric diseases. Sometimes you can go directly into children. So for instance, Alexion has done this with Strensiq. They actually went directly into children, but they went into a patient population. You don't really do healthy volunteer studies in children. So you would have to look at what it is that you want the drug to do, what's your intended patient population, What's the intended age? Is there an age range? Pediatric studies are so difficult because children grow. And as they grow, their bodies change completely in terms of their, how big they are and how much drug they may need to have an effect, how they metabolize the drug, how they distribute the drug. So there's actually, you've got to do cohorts of, age-controlled patients. And so it really does depend on what you're looking at in terms of a population. So a lot of the there are pediatric investigational plans, so PIPs that go along with different indications, and those are things that I work through with the agency as to what the development plan should be going forward in children. Am I answering your question? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to do a healthy volunteer study in children? No. So if it's a drug that's approved in an adult population, you'll look to adjust the dose based on pharmacokinetics, your distribution information, your pharmacodynamic data, and come up with a protocol that makes sense for that patient population and for the age of the children that you're looking to treat. Does that help you? So for the phase 2 and right, so it's almost a phase 1/2 at that point. So if if you have clinical information about the drug in adults, then you may do a study that looks at more than one endpoint. So in addition to safety, because you're in patients, you're probably going to look for preliminary signs of activity, and we're going to talk about that and surrogate endpoints in a minute. Okay. So just getting back to phase 1 studies, these usually these are dose escalation studies. So in healthy volunteers, generally you do a single ascending dose trial, and then you'll follow it with a multiple ascending dose. What you do is you're going to start at a dose where the FDA says this is safe. We expect to see no side effects. You'll treat a cohort of patients, probably 3 or so. If you don't see any side effects, you'll go to the next dose level, and you'll keep going up. When you start to see some side effects, you may enroll some more patients. Depending on what those look like, you may decide to drop your dose down. But you're going to take that information and move it into a multiple dose where folks, instead of just getting one dose, will get maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 doses at a particular interval. All of the time, you're going to be looking at the pharmacokinetics of the drug, and you may be looking for routes of excretion as well. The studies generally take about 1 to 2 years, and there's a 30% failure rate for this particular phase of development. Okay? So what do you do after that? You've got your phase 1 study. You'll probably go and have an interaction with the agency, and you'll probably say to them, at the end of phase 1, this is the information that we have. We want to move forward into a patient population. At that point in time, you'll propose a protocol. It'll either be a single-arm study, which is often used in oncology to get some preliminary read, or it'll be a randomized clinical trial where folks will be randomized to your experimental agent versus either a placebo or another drug that's approved in the same patient population. These are larger, longer, more expensive clinical studies. These are in the hundreds of patient range rather than the tens of patients. They run about 2 years if you're lucky. And the emphasis is still on safety, but this is where we're going to look for preliminary signs of activity. So does the drug do what we want it to do? And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about endpoints. I know Colin said that there was some interest in looking at endpoints, so we'll get to that in a moment. But again, about a third of the drugs are going to pass through phase 2. And on your way to your phase 3 trial, again, you'll probably check in with the FDA, show them your phase 2 data, talk to them about your phase 3 design. Your phase 3 trial design is very important from a regulatory perspective. This is probably your pivotal trial. This is where you need to convince the FDA that your drug is safe and effective and supports the labeling that you want. Typically, there are thousands of patients enrolled in these trials. Cardiovascular drug trials are up in the tens of thousands. Oncology, probably closer to 500 to 1,000. Rare diseases, I think Alexion filed Strensiq with 70 some odd patients in the entire application. So there's a large variability, but it really does depend upon the number of patients that are available and actually have the disease that you're interested in. Okay? But these are very well-controlled trials. You'll work with the agency to understand what they believe is a viable endpoint for the trial, what looks like something that is approvable to them. They will let you know if they have any particular safety concerns, anything that they want you to monitor more carefully, anything that they expect you to report on. So all of those things, these trials have a big range because it just depends on how long it takes to reach your primary endpoint. So some of those are very long, others are not so much. Prevention trials can last, 20 plus years or so. The average length is about 5 years, and about 25 to 30% of drugs move through phase 3 to basically a pre-NDA phase. Okay? Sure. So if we get to it at the end of my presentation, and if we don't, I have slides that you can have, which talk about the special designations that the FDA has, and there's several of them, and they all mean different things. So there's breakthrough designation, there's fast track, there's accelerated approval, and then there's an orphan drug designation. So they all mean slightly different things in terms of how much information and guidance the agency will give you. Okay. So if we don't get to it, Colin will send you the slides, and it's in the back. Okay. As I was indicating, so you're going to interact with the agency. They can, at any time, put a clinical hold on you. So if they find that your protocol is deficient, they can basically stop you or not let you initiate that trial until you make the changes that they want. So there is a dialogue that happens that goes back and forth between the sponsor and the agency as it relates to protocols. Generally speaking, you can't ignore what the agency is telling you, because at some point, they will make you listen. All right. So endpoints. I know that, yes. Mm-hmm. So generally, when they put a hold on you for a trial that's ongoing, there's a safety risk. And in that case, yes, it's a full stop. The types of procedural holds usually happen. When you submit a protocol and you add it to your IND, the FDA will review it. There's a 30-day review period before you can start, and it's also reviewed by the Institutional Review Board. So you've got to pass through two review hurdles. If they have concerns about your design, that's where you're going to hear about it. So it's going to be before you get going at all. But if they do, they have done it. So there have been a couple of gene therapy protocols where there have been patients who died unexpectedly. There's a full stop clinical hold. Any trial ongoing in the United States stopped. Cease and desist. You cannot administer drug anymore. They do pick back up again. It depends. It depends. Potentially, yes. So if you have a patient who has not reached an endpoint for you and you stopped and then that patient went on to receive other therapy because maybe they had cancer and you didn't want to withhold treatment from them, that patient is really lost to you in terms of helping you reach your endpoint. But there may be other patients who maybe were enrolled earlier who reached their endpoint and came off study prior to the clinical hold, and that data is still good. Mm-hmm. You can have as many protocols as you want filed to a single IND as long as it stays within that particular review division. So in other words, in oncology, all protocols go to the Division of Hematology and Oncology. So as long as let's just say your drug is for cancer, and maybe you want to explore it in lung cancer and colon cancer, and so you're going to file all of those protocols to one IND. The agency is now looking for electronic submissions, so you can think of it as a giant filing cabinet. And what you're doing every time is you're cross-referencing back to earlier information rather than resubmitting it again. But if you have to switch divisions, it's a different story. So you can do them either way. You can do a trial in the US and you can submit that data internationally. The large pharmaceutical countries, the multinational pharma companies, generally do their trials on a global basis because it helps them with marketing uptake, because now you've got investigators who are familiar with your drug because they were part of the clinical trial. So they know kind of the ins and outs of how it works and where it works well and what the risks are. So there's a benefit to doing it. This presentation is just very US focused because the regulations are different in different parts of the world. There is a harmonization. They do, for the most part, they do accept data coming from different countries. But generally speaking, with the exception of Japan, which is slightly different, they generally need you to do some clinical trials in Japan if you're going to submit for regulatory approval there. Okay. Any other questions? I'm sure I'm running way over. Oh, okay, sorry. So getting back to endpoints, we talked about how phase 1 studies have a safety endpoint. Phase 2 studies are where we look for preliminary efficacy, and here's where you're going to hear things like surrogate endpoint. So what is a surrogate endpoint? It's something that's epidemiologically related to the real endpoint. So you can think about blood pressure. If you can control someone's blood pressure, their risk of dying from a cardiovascular event is lower. So a lot of the early endpoints will look only at blood pressure, and that's the primary endpoint. And mortality from CV disease is a secondary endpoint. So it allows the sponsor to make a decision on a near-term endpoint, but yet follow out to that longer term. We do it in oncology as well. We look at response rate or tumor shrinkage. So how much regression of the tumor have I demonstrated, which is an indicator of overall survival. So if I can control the tumor, I'm going to expect that the patient is going to live longer. Okay? The important part here is that the FDA must agree that your surrogate marker, your surrogate endpoint is validated. If they don't agree and you use it and you think you're going to get some sort of an accelerated approval based on phase 2 data, you won't. So the big one in oncology is PSA, prostate-specific antigen. It is used to make treatment decisions. If your PSA is increasing, even if everything else looks the same, it's a good bet that your doctor is going to change your treatment in some way. From a pharmaceutical development perspective, you can't file just PSA data and expect that the agency is going to give you an approval for some subset of prostate cancer patients, because they've said that they don't think this is a validated or reliable endpoint. So this is a very important discussion to have with the agency before you start your phase 2 study, especially if you're going for some sort of an accelerated approval. The other thing to remember about accelerated approval based on phase 2 data is that you're still required to do a confirmatory randomized phase 3 study. If your phase 3 study does not support continued marketing authorization will be withdrawn, and it has been. So they're very serious about that, and they expect you to do it in a very timely manner, or they get very upset with you. Okay? And then for phase 3 studies, really you're trying to measure something that matters to the patient. That's what the agency will tell you. So how does the patient feel, function, or survive? That's got to be one of the endpoints. It can be a patient-reported outcome. There's a lot of challenges in working with that data. And it can also be a composite endpoint, which means that you're looking at a number of different factors and they all have to trend in one general way in order to get it. Now, the Cures Act has also said that the agency must now consider what's called real-world data. I wish I could tell you what that means, but nobody's really sure right now. In the past, the agency hasn't liked that. There's been a lot of talk about filing paper NDAs and whether or not you can use peer-reviewed journal articles to support a particular indication. Generally speaking, they've not reacted well to that, but the Cures Act has told them that they have to consider it. So how they're going to consider it, and I don't think it's going to replace randomized clinical trials, but it certainly is a way for patients to have more influence over the agency than they have in the past. Okay? And then just real quick, the NDA process is multi-step as well. So there's a pre-NDA period, so you're going to have a quick meeting with the FDA. You're going to hopefully get their agreement that the data that you have in hand is sufficient, something to file. You're going to then submit it. They're going to look at it really quickly and say, we're going to review it for a few days. We think you have what you need. We don't. If they agree to file it, they'll review it all again. There'll be questions. And there are a lot of kind of complexities in there. One point is that you all have probably seen a package insert or a label. That's probably the most heavily negotiated document in an NDA. Every word of it. Nothing more so than the indication. Because the indication for a pharmaceutical company is what they can sell the drug as. The industry is no longer allowed to sell outside of the labeled indication. So that language and the wording is very, very important, and it's very, very heavily debated as folks move through the process. So I know I'm cutting into Tim's time, but the last part is that after your NDA is approved, as part of that approval, you'll get a list of what's called post-marketing commitments. One of them is post-marketing surveillance. This could take many different forms, but basically the agency is going to ask you, especially if your drug was approved with a relatively small number of patients in your NDA, that you continue to monitor safety in some sort of a reasonable way, because there are adverse events which happen at a very low frequency or happen only in a particular genetic subgroup of people. They might not show up right away, and so they just want to know about that. So there are other types of commitments that the agency may ask for as well, but that's probably the most common. Okay? So thanks very much. And as I said, Colin has the slides. He's more than happy to distribute them to anybody who wants them. And there is kind of a breakdown of the sub-classifications in the back. Okay, and there's also, for those of you who are diehards, there's kind of also a list of kind of the key regulations around each of the phases of development if you're interested. I know it's very exciting to read regulations, but so thank you. Sure. Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, the FDA has become more conservative on the safety side. So it's more of the first do no harm kind of philosophy by the agency. They've had some very interesting reviews lately, mostly in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, where patient advocacy groups did not agree with the decision of the agency. And so I think that goes a little bit to the Cures Act and, what is the agency going to consider from real world. It's clear that the Cures Act, the law itself, was intended to give patients more of a voice. I don't think it's clear yet how that's going to play out. But I do think that the environment that we're working in is certainly, in the last 5 years, has definitely become more conservative from a safety perspective, and especially in early clinical trials. And I think that's because there have been, not in this country, but in Europe, there have been a couple of trials that have had unexpected patient deaths in them. And so it actually led the EMA to issue a new guidance on data that needs to be presented for first-in-man and what issues the EMA considers to be red flags moving from preclinical into the clinic. And what we've heard is that the FDA is actually referencing that document when they're talking to sponsors. So it wouldn't surprise me if they issue a similar type guidance in the not too distant future. Yeah.
You'll remember it later.
So, as I said in the beginning, Tim is a partner at Canaan, but he's not just coming here as an investor. He's also a physician. He's been successful for several companies, and been an executive on the chairman of a few boards, and is on the board of several companies, chairman at Arvinas.
Good. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. I think I know many faces here. So I'm going to change directions a little bit and talk about the sector, really biotech sector, from an investor perspective in terms of how we think about it. Some of this will relate directly to what you heard from Marcia. I'm going to speak primarily about what is really the startup community or the private community, the venture-backed community. But first, the larger biotech environment is always important to the private community. So I just wanted to start with putting up what the public markets in biotech have looked like starting with the last decade. And I guess the pointer doesn't work. But this is a 10-year view. And the red line is an index called the Nasdaq Biotech Index. So this is a collection of companies that track the biotech performance in Nasdaq, where most biotechs are listed. The green is the Nasdaq, and the blue line is the Dow Jones. So you can see over the past 10-year period, the biotech sector is way outperformed, these more traditional indices. In fact, it's outperformed really any sector that's out in the public market. So it's been a real boom time for biotechs in general. You can see that peak, though, about in the middle of 2015, where you see that large spike in the red, and it's pulled back a bit since that time. But even with that pullback, it's still twice the Nasdaq, and almost 5 times what the Dow Jones has done. The other interesting thing I find, if you look back on these graphs to 2008, when the world was in calamity, and there was as close to the Great Depression as we ever had, in a big correction in the stock market, in the 10-year view, it's almost invisible, which is just shocking to me. So that's that little blip down you see over on the left-hand side to the left of 2010. That's 2008. So it's amazing to me how cataclysmic that event was. And then when you look forward from then, it's almost not measurable in the scale. This is the 5-year view. So if you look at a shorter-term view, again, the sector has done very well. But again, if you look back there at January in 2014, or the middle of 2014, you're actually trading about even now. So over about the past 2.5 years, if you got in 2.5 years ago, you haven't done so well. So you really had to get that first part of the curve really to get the benefit. And then this is a 2-year view, and things have flip-flopped. So again, the red line is the Nasdaq Biotech Index. And again, the green and the blue are the Nasdaq and the Dow. And over the last 2 years, the biotech world is undergoing what people call a correction. So again, it's down about 17% on an absolute basis. But again, the gap between its performance and those other 2 indices is closer to 30%. So again, there's been a pullback here, and you see a lot of noise in that red line. I think that noise follows campaign tweets. If you put them together. So, and again, where this pullback really started, people really linked to a Hillary Clinton tweet about Martin Shkreli around pricing of that drug, if you can remember 2 years ago. I'm not sure that's why it remains down, but again, a lot of times investors look for a reason to pull back, particularly when things have ridden up and people started getting the heebie-jeebies as the election approached. So that's the public sector. So again, it's very productive, cooled off in the past 2 years, but has been very strong. So now I'm going to move to private company data or venture data, where I live and spend most of my time now. The one thing I would say is one interesting thing, when you look at that biotech sector and that performance, big drivers of that were companies like the one we're sitting in right now. So again, companies like Alexion were absolutely the stars of that decade, and part of the companies, Biogen, Idec, Gilead, Insight. So the whole generation of what have become now very mature companies that really drove that performance. And it's interesting that we're sitting in one of those that helped drive that. So this looks at the money that healthcare venture capital firms raise. So in venture capital, if you have a venture capital firm, we raise funds, and we raise that money from other investors. And typically our money comes, people think it's like rich people. Almost all of it's from pension funds, so teachers' pensions, police, firemen, city pension plans, and endowments. So those are the two biggest sources. So that's where we go out and get money. And as you can see over time, this goes back to 2009. You can see the blue line is what funds have raised. Ignore the other line. So this is the money coming into funds, and you see a dip back in the Depression. Everyone thought this was dead. The world was dead. Don't do this. And then gradually, as performance started improving, more and more money has come into the market, to where last year in 2015 was a record, and this year it was close to a record, or 2016 was close to a record of money coming in. So this is a sector, because of that performance, where people wanted to put money. I would say as the time to have put money in was back in 2010, though. Again, because when you're putting all this money in at the peak of the market, that's usually, you're supposed to buy low, sell high. And again, this is just classic of the opposite behavior. It's easy to say in retrospect, but this is money chasing returns. So again, you would do very well if you were the small group of people who are actually putting money into venture in 2010, if you had courage to do that. This in turn, so that was the money coming into venture firms. This is the money going from venture firms into startup companies. Okay, so this looks at how that money goes out to create companies. So again, this is the total amount of money in biotech and biopharma. So this doesn't include all ventures. So this data is skewed to that. And as you can see in 2015, again, that was a record year. So in the year that the public markets were at its highest level, more money came in than ever. And now as you see that correction you're starting to see, that money's just getting invested now as the public markets are coming down. The question is, what will the private markets do? But, so again, where you would have done extremely well, or these people who, back in these days when, this was more typical, where $4 million a year came in to biopharma venture back in 2011, 2012. So record year last year, near record year this year, a lot of money coming into venture. And again, the macro reason for this is, one, people look at what's going on the public side and said, well, I want to get involved in this even earlier because the returns are even better if you can get in early. But the other thing has been, the low interest rate environment. So again, if you're a pension fund and you need to make your pension commitments, bonds giving you a 1% return, you're never going to get there. So in the low interest rate environment that we've had since the recession, people have been looking for places to make money, again, to support things like pension plans. And they've looked at these alternative asset classes more and more, and it's led to a lot of money coming in. This is, again, Series A money coming in to venture-backed startup companies. So again, 2016 was a record for the amount of money coming into startups in biopharma. So again, you can see that number was $2.1 billion. Usually it's about $1 billion a year that comes in. So you can see the last few years, particularly 15 and 16, being almost twice of what historically has come in. You can see that a lot of that, if you look over this period of time, again, is oncology, rare diseases, and neuro. We'll talk a little bit more about why that is. Marcia commented on some of those things. The middle line, CVC deals, represents, that's corporate venture capital. So they're institutional investors, venture capital like my firm. Then all of the big pharma companies now have what are called corporate venture capital firms. And that's because they want to be involved in this ecosystem because it's a feeder for the large companies. So they like to get involved early, not because they're particularly interested in the investment, but because they want to follow early stage technologies and they, as they say, have a seat at the table. So when something looks interesting, they can pounce on it. This I'll skip, but these are just, again, the last 2 years of the most active Series A investors. And it's really a mixture of institutional investors and corporate investors. So institutional investors like Canaan, OrbiMed, Arch, and then big companies. You see Pfizer up there is number 2. So again, a big trend has been big companies wanting to get involved in this little universe because this is where a lot of innovation is coming from. So you see Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, Novo, Johnson & Johnson, Celgene. All these guys are now very active in private company formation. These are the areas where money's going. So when you look at where that startup money is going, what type of companies is it going into? This is one of my favorite slides because I think it's, it's really neat from one perspective. It's really problematic from another perspective. So as you can see, the oncology startups, this is over 2 years, are in the 70s, right? And just totally outweigh anything else in there. And that's for a few reasons. One's for scientific reasons, because we've learned a lot about mechanisms in cancer, and they're a lot genetically driven. And if you can hit that genetic abnormality, it can really have an effect. That's the scientific reason. FDA is another reason. So this is one area where the FDA can be, I would say, more reasonable than other areas. I wouldn't call them entirely reasonable, but you generally get more support in oncology. The other area is, what other reason for this is? Anyone want to take a guess? Pricing. You can price oncology drugs. Again, because there's, we have the moonshot now, right? President Biden's out there. He's going to help us cure cancer. This is just a high interest area. It's the continuing war on cancer. So there's a lot, you can price drugs much more easily in cancer than you can in other areas. But another equal anomalies we sit in Alexion is orphan and rare diseases. So that's about 25. So that's pretty good, 25 startups for rare genetic diseases. Now, what's the anomaly? Some of you know me, and you know what the anomaly is here. Look at this slide and what's really peculiar about this slide. If you think from a public health perspective, what's the number one cause of mortality in the United States? Cardiovascular disease, the bottom of the list, right? So from a public health perspective, this makes no sense. Why is it the bottom of the list? FDA, a nightmare. It just enormously expensive. So 70 patients for a rare drug, tens of thousands of patients in clinical studies to get a cardiovascular drug, and 5 years, 10 to 12 years minimum. So there's an FDA, we call those headwinds. We don't like headwinds. Other reason. This is drugs. So my focus is really on my drugs. Other reason is pricing. So cardiovascular disease was the place where pharma played 20 years ago. Huge innovation, a whole host of drugs, reduced cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, all became generic. So these are all generic drugs now, and if it's going to cost you $2 billion to develop a drug, you can't price it at pennies a day, but that's what the market says it's worth. So when people talk about pricing, I always try to point out there's good things about inexpensive drugs, but there's a downside. And I tell folks, if you better like the cardiovascular drugs you have today, because those are the ones you're going to have in 20 years. It's a gift to society to have those drugs for pennies a day. And when we think about the value proposition of the drugs, we can't just talk about the price at launch. We have to talk about the pennies a day nowadays. And the other part of this, 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago, people said cancer was going to overtake cardiovascular disease as the number one cause of mortality. It's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because we've stopped innovating in cardiovascular disease, and we've been innovating like crazy in oncology disease. And cardiovascular disease will remain the number one. So it's just, to me, a very interesting anomaly. As investors, we're not going to take on generic markets. We're not going to take on ungodly trials. It's just the way it is. And it's a point I always try to make to people who, get on bandwagons politically, because I think that, the drug pricing, I agree it's all problematic, but it can't be addressed with a sledgehammer, because if you want cheap drugs, that's the level of innovation you're going to get. Okay, that's my preaching. Again, series rounds of money. So again, more money is in venture. Series A deals used to be around 15 million. Last year, around 26 million, or around 36 million. So over 2 times increase in the amount of money companies are able to raise in their first round. That's great for companies. May not be so great from an investment perspective, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But again, so companies, not only more companies are starting, but companies are starting with more money. We did a company here in New Haven with Li Ping Chen, Series A, $65 million. So another company, New Haven, Biohaven, Series A, $80 million. I mean, these were unheard of 5 years ago. It's because there's more money in the system and more money chasing outcomes. May end in a way that's not good. I'll skip this, more detail than we need to get. So that's the input side. Now this is the output side, so exits. So again, the total values on the vertical axis by year, again, looking over a period of 5 years. And again, what you see, exits, the way we get our money back is companies get acquired. That's called, what is it called? Big exit upfront payments, big exit milestones. So an exit's an acquisition. The other way we exit is the companies become publicly traded. So our private shares, which are entirely illiquid in a company, go on a public market where we can trade them and get money for those. So as you can see, again, there's been a big uptick in exit values, just like in the private market. But this has been even more productive from a venture perspective. So if you look at 2015, again, it takes about 5 years for a company to exit. So if you look at 5 years, the amount of money that went into companies to start back that time was about $5 million. And again, this exit value is over $20 billion. So that's over a 4-fold return on that money. That's just a rough model, but that's roughly the way it's worked. So venture funds that were investing back in 2009, 2010, 2011 are having great returns because of these exits in the last 3 years. As I said, though, the amount of money, and this is all healthcare exits, so this is biotech, but also devices. You can see about 80% of them are driven by biotech. So again, that's the predominant exit, and the most valuable exits in healthcare. So if you look at 2016, again, that's about $18 billion. We said about $9 billion went into healthcare this year, and about $3 billion went into devices. So about a total of $12 billion went in. So $12 billion went in 2016, and 18 is coming out. If you just look at it year by year, that's okay, but it's not so great. But that's not really what that $12 billion is doing. That $12 billion is doing exits in 2020. If that 2020 reverts back to that $8 billion back on slide 12, then the industry is in trouble. And this is the question of what is going to happen. So more money is coming in, exit values are going down. That's a mismatch and may really cause some issues. Again, this is just the light blue are M&As, the dark blue is M&As, the light blue are IPOs. So again, when those public markets were really strong in 14 and 15, a lot of companies were going public and doing well. And so that was a huge wave of exits from IPOs. You can see the M&As are much more consistent. So again, when we think of investing in this, we sort of try to forget the IPO market because it comes and goes, and we try to target this M&A environment just because, again, as you can see, there are huge fluxes in IPOs. There are years when there's 0 IPOs in healthcare and in biotech, and we've all lived through those. So there's been a big uptake in IPOs, but again, it's diminishing now. And again, this year we'll see what happens. This is I love. So this is where exits occur. So M&A means the company got acquired. And as you can see, there's a huge shift to early merger and acquisition. So, unimaginable 8 years ago. But large companies are coming in and buying things preclinical, phase 1 and phase 2. And as you can see, there are virtually no phase 3 exits. If you get into phase 3 and you're not acquired, it usually means there's something wrong, that your thing's not valuable enough or your data's not strong enough. Very few valuable assets last phase 3. But for people who like doing R&D things, this is great because if you can do something real interesting on the R&D side and get some Series A funding, Series B funding, and take it from an idea that's preclinical or clinical data, you can have a nice outcome. But you can see that's quite a shift even over this 5-year period. But again, so companies are buying earlier. Again, this is just how much time it takes and the value of when companies get acquired. So you can see the median upfront, the top line is the median upfront value. So that's what you get paid in cash on day one. And that's about $200 million. It's been, stays pretty stable, but a little bit higher. Then particularly in biotech mergers, you often get back-end payments, so earn-outs, they're called. As your asset or your company's assets continue to progress, you get payments downstream when it gets to phase 3 or gets approved. So usually M&As, you get upfront and milestone payments with them. And so the total deal values get around $500 million. Again, one bothersome trend is the exits in the aggressive years have been 4 years, and this year look like 6 years. One data point isn't a trend, but again, if the exits take longer, again, the model doesn't work as well. Again, this is what's getting acquired. Again, I won't belabor it because it's the same stuff we've talked about. So again, oncology, neurology dominate. And again, time to exit's about 4.3 years. And if you look, this is by phase. Again, you can see most of the activity is early. Again, this is just the math lesson. So the upfront exits are about $200 million. And again, some of you've talked, so say it's 250, you're doing well. If you put 50 million into it, that's a 5x return, and that's good. Because remember, when we do things, 40% of them are zero. Goose eggs, we lose money. So if we want a 2 or 3x fund, meaning our fund doubles or triples its money, we need 5 and 10x returns. So if your median upfront and total deal is 250 and 500, if you put more than 100 million of venture capital into these, you're going to be in trouble because you can't get 5x and 10x returns. So our general math is we shoot for things that with 50 million, you think you can exit for a minimum of 250, ideally 500 or north. And that's the way we think about it, because you need large multiple exits to offset your losers so that your fund as a whole can be a 3x fund. So again, but these are real exits, and you see how much money is going in those. Those are in the history of the company. It ranges $30 to $50 million, and those are the successful companies on average. I don't know. I'd have to look at what it is. Again, I think they're small numbers, and I'd have to figure out what company it is. So again, I think it may be an issue of small numbers. And again, these are just IPOs. Again, just as trends with IPOs, you see this huge spike. And again, the IPOs that did really well. So again, the markets were really strong 2012, 13, 14, week 15, 16. So if you went public in 2012, you did great because the markets were going like this. If you went public in 2013, you missed part of it, but you were still doing all right. When everyone went public in 2014, you get public, and the markets go like that, 2015 and 2016, doesn't create a happy environment. So all those public investors who invested in these, expecting to see that trajectory to keep going that way, lose money here. And that's when the public markets shut down, because people don't like losing money. So again, people look at this and say, wow, that guy's making money, I got to get into this. And oftentimes by the time you get into it, I said you're chasing money and you end up on the wrong end of it. So again, you have to be very careful to follow momentum, because momentum changes, and if you get caught, you're in trouble. So again, that's the IPO. The interesting thing here, though, carved out in the little orange boxes, again, early stage IPOs. So again, a totally different world where early stage technology are valued in public markets as well. So preclinical companies going public, right? And the real companies going public, not only do you need revenues, you need profitability. Preclinical companies are, maybe never going to be generate revenues, but at a minimum are 10, 15 years away from it. So, biotech IPOs are a very different sort of thing. This is the amount of money. So the top line is what's called the pre-money valuation. So when you go public, people value your company. So it's equivalent to M&A value as an investor. So is what's someone going to pay for part of this company, and that values the company. And you can see that range is a little bit less than 200. So typically, M&As are always more valuable to an investor than an IPO. The other thing is when companies go public, when public companies get acquired, investors get cash. Straightforward. When they go public, our private stock becomes public stock in the public markets. That's not cash. And again, these companies are what are called relatively illiquid, meaning if I own, say that company is out there and it's worth $300 million, and I own $50 million of stock, it's very hard to sell $50 million of stock in a $300 million company without tanking the company. So as an investor in public companies, biotech companies, it takes a long time to get your money out. So again, M&As are always easier for an investor because you get your money in a single day and you're done. Here, after companies go public, it often takes us 2 or 3 years to get our money out. And again, during that time, you're subject to the risk of the market. So if your company went public in beginning of 2015 and you thought you had this much and the market goes like this over the next 2 years, you have half that much by the time you get your money out. So that, I'll just park it there so we can leave time for questions. Just follow up on just one other factor, following up on Marcia's comments. So the FDA approvals have been fairly strong during this period as well, and that's been seen by the sector as a positive thing. Again, like everything else, they've been most strong in oncology and rare diseases, invisible, and things like cardiovascular disease. So again, it's these same trends you see throughout. But the trend changed this year. So last 2 or 3 years, there were about 42 approvals of novel biological or chemical entities. So that last year, the number was about half of that. And again, that's a big red flag. And from a business perspective, analysts project sales from those volumes of new things being approved. So the volume of sales this year is about half of what it's been over the last 3 years as people start projecting out, which again suggests if that's a continuing trend, again, what was a great market is going to go into a cyclical, downturn, which wouldn't be unusual. It's frankly the expectation. So let me park there and just take questions. Actually, one other comment, though, again, back to the ecosystem. Over the past, probably 10 years, of the drugs approved by FDA, half of them have come from small companies. So they're often then owned by larger companies or licensed by larger companies. But literally, of the new drugs entering the market, half of them end up coming from companies, startup companies, that subsequently get acquired. So again, it's a great part of the ecosystem, and that's why we do it, because we know the larger companies are never going to be able to keep meeting their pipeline needs. So to me, it's a phenomenal number that little startup companies end up accounting for 50% of the products. Ultimately, they get to the market. All those were private, and then they go public. So those all started, so they start as private companies, and then, investors always look with the company, what do we do next here to get the company the next amount? Companies need money. One source is, again, private money. Other source is public money. So again, if you can get public money at a good valuation, that's something we think about doing. And a lot of companies need more money than we're going to do. So again, like our firm, if we get up to $25 million in a company, we start getting a little nervous beyond that point. So if it is a company that ends up needing, for instance, more than $100 million, we're not going to be able to keep up with that because, again, it would put too much risk in one of our funds around one company. So again, those are situations where we'd look to take the company public. A deal? From what perspective, a company deal? So as companies progress, so let me just take small companies. As small companies progress, every step of the way, you need to be looking forward and saying, okay, what's coming next? What do I need to do to be able to do this successfully? Can I do this successfully, or do I need help from someone else in terms of competencies? Do I need help from someone else financially? So if you're a small company and you're headed to a large randomized controlled trial, those run from tens of millions to $100 million. So there, you're going to need help financially. Most small companies also aren't set up to do the very large randomized controlled trials. Large companies have infrastructure in countries around the world, regulatory people around the world, staff around the world, and can execute those things. So if I'm a small company and I need a lot of money and I need a lot of executional power, that's going to say, okay, this is something I'm going to try to do a deal around, again, to tap into someone else's resources to get this done. In exchange for those resources, cash and manpower, I give up some ownership of the asset. From the investor perspective of companies? Oh, okay. So early on, well, so again, like I said, as investors, I can have a lot of strong opinions about what's wrong with the world. As I invest, I need to ignore those challenges. And again, as I said, we invest with tailwinds. So our dollars are not going to change the FDA's view. Our dollars are not going to change a drug formulary's view on what something's worth. Those battles not going to be won in the lifetime of our fund. So we look for things that aren't going to face crazy challenges. And those are the same things that big pharma companies are looking at because they can't just take on those challenges either. So the market for small companies, there's the ultimate market, but really the market we stay in touch with are large pharma companies and large biotech companies. Listening to what they're interested in, why they're interested in doing it. And again, usually they're interested because the regulatory path is reasonable and you can price the drug. And from their bearings, we take our bearings because, again, we're part of that ecosystem. And in one way or another, these assets are going to either end up in a partnership with one of those guys or owned by one of those guys. So we really take our bearings from what's going on in the larger market, what big pharma is looking to do, what they're looking to do to fill their pipeline. And that may be, they may be looking for assets. Again, Arvinas is an example where, you can help someone with assets, but it's a whole new type of drug. And a lot of the big pharma companies are looking for just novel ways to create drugs, like antibodies were and like RNA technologies were. Those sort of platforms play. So in one of those slides, you see platforms are a very popular investment as well. So that's our market. We stay in constant contact with those folks, and that's where we get our bearings. So again, not only is venture money not going into cardiovasculars, these big pharma money is not going in there either. Right, because they see the same things we do, and if they're not going to take it on, we're certainly not going to take it on. And that's why I see all this alignment, and it aligns to the FDA. I mean, it all changed. If you look at FDA approvals, it's dominated by oncology. So it becomes a little bit self-fulfilling. And again, one thing we ask ourselves, when will it change? It's like I started developing cardiovascular drugs. I look at the situation, I say, somehow this has got to change. So I look in the environment, so what things can change that? Is there some genetic insight that gives you a better handle on, personalized treatment for cardiovascular disease? The answer is largely no, so far. Is there resurgent interest? So are there 2 or 3 pharma companies that actually are starting to do cardiovascular things? So maybe not 10 of them are, but maybe 2 or 3 are looking at this and saying, look, there's still a big need here. There's nothing going on. So we always keep abreast of the things we're not doing and try to figure out, is it time for us to shift our gears a little bit now? Again, we've been looking at our portfolio and said, we have to do stuff other than oncology. Yeah, so it's just a local one. Right, Celldex merged with Coltan. So that happens too. Those are usually somebody's struggling and finding a way out. So they're sort of like mergers of critical mass. Let's put 2 companies together. Let's take the best assets of the 2 companies, dump the lesser assets. Let's take the pooled resources of 2 companies and try to do things with more critical mass behind it. So that does happen. More rare. So those are mergers. They're not. So in those things, if you're merging, you're not getting money. You're getting the other company's stock. Those don't work for us because again, those are really what we call a liquid stock. No one will buy them. So those are things. Those for us. Those are sort of surviving for another day, they're not valuable, outcomes for us. They're sort of a way to, have a second chance. You start.
Why are they tougher? So I think that it's just the nature of having some novel things to look at. When they know less about something, I think it makes them more nervous. They do get a lot of negative press when something bad happens, right? So as being an arm of the government, they want to avoid that at all costs. And so I think what the Cures Act is trying to do is balance that conservatism that is growing within the FDA, and that's really a reaction to what they've seen with some of these novel products. The flip side of that is there's a tremendous push from patient advocates for the FDA to kind of loosen the reins, maybe not be so critical. I mean, this came up with a big debate with Duchenne's, right? What's approvable and what's good enough? So if you can think of, if you are the parent of a child with Duchenne's and there's nothing available, and you know that your child is just going to become more and more gravely ill, you're willing to take risks that someone else may not be willing to take. And so the Cures Act is really, I think, trying to give a voice to that, and that goes to, real-world evidence. The problem with real-world evidence is that it's not collected in a controlled manner, and it makes it very difficult to interpret. So how the agency is going to use that information with all of the other information that they're required to review is just difficult to say. But I don't see them becoming less conservative on the safety front for a while.
I think they'd only get less conservative if they didn't get pulled into Congress every time something happens. In our business, it's going to happen. I don't care how many oversight committees you have. The notion that you can do this entirely safety without risk is folly. Okay, but that's the way people treat this endeavor. And, sympathetically for them, I wouldn't want to be getting called into Congress for those things and getting grilled, so I'm going to do everything I can to avoid it. So, it's a problem, but the system's crazy. Again, look, this is a pretty sophisticated group. All guideline committees, Cochrane, there are all sorts of ways where people can categorize level of evidence in terms of how much evidence supports the use of something, right? There are groups that do this as a living now. I think the argument from the patient side is, let me look at that and see if I'm willing to accept that level of evidence, particularly in these life-threatening situations. And it's going to be hard to avoid because people are going to have access to the information. Well, again, the FDA says they approved a lot of things at the end of 2015 that were scheduled to be approved in 2016. So they come up with a lot of answers. But again, I think the complete response letters, I don't think you got to all your definitions. Complete response letter is a euphemism for rejection. I think they went from 4 to like 18. So there's a big number of things that didn't get through. So it may just be a year. That's possible. But it's hard to say. And again, right, it's an organization where the head of the organization wasn't sure if he had a job with the next administration or not. So like in companies, when that stuff goes on, you can imagine the FDA, we don't know who's going to be our boss. I'm not going to put myself out there.
I think the other thing, too, is there is a lot of criticism at the FDA that depending upon which division you submit to, you're held to a different standard. And that's something that's fairly well documented. We can't change it. You work with the division that you're assigned based on the patient population of interest. But yes, there are absolutely differences depending on the division you apply.
Yeah, so we call it one thing. It's thousands of people. And depending on who you're dealing with, I mean, there's some attempt to keep it congruent, but they're individuals just like we are who have different opinions about things. So it is a bit of a crapshoot. And so, if you're a reviewer who got burned on your last one, you're going to be pretty careful on your next one. I think it depends on the indication. So again, payers will go, again, they won't go after emotional things. So they will, they have what we say a soft touch on cancer. That's a tough thing to take on with your, if you're a healthcare system, that's a tough thing to take on with your customers. On the other hand, for less life-threatening things, they will push you. So drugs are tiered, for a lot of common chronic decisions. And even if there's a new one, you're getting the cheap one until that doesn't work. And then you're getting the next cheapest one until that doesn't work. And the next cheapest one. And again, the example is with lipids. And, there's a nice story in either the Journal or the Times about a guy who had a genetic lipid abnormality who needed a PCSK9 inhibitor that now are approved. And it's taken him 12 months to run the gauntlet through the things that aren't going to work to get there. So it depends on the condition, what the payer is willing to fight.
Yeah, and some of it is due to patient-reported outcomes. So quality of life outcomes often are used to support better pricing. And certainly, as Tim was alluding to, in certain diseases, the more lines of therapy you go through, the more difficult your disease becomes to treat. So you want to be able to get that innovative drug up front. And there's an argument to be made for that. But it's incumbent upon the company to present that data to payers.
So one thing I just, with this 21st Century Cures Act, so again, I was looking at alternative data sources. One of the most interesting things I've seen was in the December 1st issue of the New England Journal. Again, pertains to PCSK9 inhibitors. And this is from a group called Global Genomics Group. And this is a group that has a lot of genetic information from prospectively collected patients with cardiovascular disease. And they've paired that information, and it's all omics. It's not just genetic. It's any omics you can think of. I forget what they have, like 80,000 patients. And then they've paired that with a lot of the basic science knowledge that's been developed from 20 or 30 years of developing cardiovascular drugs. And again, they've used artificial intelligence and big data to predict the outcome of the outcome studies for PCSK9 inhibitors while the studies are going on. So again, these are studies that are hundreds of thousands of patients, probably $250 million. And the study says that it's going to work, based on our ability to use big data of omics, big data of clinical trials that have already happened, big data of basic science. And it'll be interesting to see, because those are the real things that really stretch people, saying, well, if we can collect data and predict this accurately, why shouldn't we try to do that? So that's an area where you can try to do that, because there's been, because there's all this history of very large clinical studies, decades of basic science work understanding lipids. And this is taking a new mechanism and plugging it into that and saying, what impact is this going to have on cardiovascular mortality? So those studies read out in the first quarter. So it'll be fascinating to see how closely these guys predicted what those outcomes are going to be. But so people pushing the envelope are saying, why shouldn't the future be like that rather than the gauntlet that we run? And I think the truth's somewhere in between. But I think, someday you'd love to be able to do that, because, this system, it really isn't sustainable to cost $2 billion to get a drug to market. It's part of the reason why they're expensive. So the reasons they're expensive is really complicated, but that's one of them. So I'll just say this. I've been doing this for 30 years. The patients have just gotten more and more expensive because the requirements just keep getting dumped on. And when you're going to do this, and we've sat in these roles, if you're going to prospectively collect data, you're not going to not collect anything because you can't go back and get it once you're done. So we used to quantify how much we quantified how much each data point costs us as a way to try to get people to stop adding additional data points. And that was 20 years ago, and it was frightening. So the data, the patient, so I'll give you another example. When I started at Bayer, we started in cancer development at Bayer because back then nobody was doing it except BMS, underserved area, easy trials, inexpensive patients. So the per patient costs were about $10,000. Now they're over $100,000 per patient in a study. So but rare disease patients are very expensive as well. So they're probably even north of that, but you need fewer of them. But in a cancer study, if you need a randomized controlled study of 1,000 patients and it's over 100,000 patients, dollars per patient, you can do the math. And that can go wrong for the tiniest reason. The drug can work and you can have a little imbalance here, or you can have a center who, enrolled patients who shouldn't have been enrolled, who have to be pulled out of the analysis, and you lose power. So there are big rolls of the dice. So every company tries to control those costs, and then there's medical inflation. So it's not like doing the things you have to do in a clinical study have gotten any less expensive in the medical system. So those costs have only gone up to, again, oncology was $10,000 a patient when I started. It's over $100,000 now. Well, first of all, I would agree with that view. So I always tell anyone, if you don't, I do venture capital, if you don't need it, don't take it. But the fact of the matter is to do these sorts of things unless you're incredibly wealthy. Webster Bank's not going to give you money, that's for sure. Yeah, so sure. Well, first of all, they're not going to fully fund it either. So again, the amounts of money here, the way we do this, if it takes $50 million to get there, there are one or two firms that do that. Third Rock will put $50 million in and do it on their own. Flagship will do it, but they're outliers. No one else, will do it because it concentrates too much risk. So, and pharma doesn't do it either. So again, and really because if anything, they do less than financial investors. We love having them on for the same reason the company loves having them on. Again, because they bring something to the table. They have a whole organization behind whatever disease you're doing. You have to keep walls because they're competitive and they're known to rip stuff off. So that's the thing you have to be careful of. And I can talk to my big pharma friends who will say, look, if it's not protected, we'll go do it. So that's the other side. The other fact, though, this has been looked at. Most M&A acquisitions are not by the strategics who are in the company. So most of them are picked off by other strategics. So it's no certainty that because they come in, they're going to end up buying it. But so we like them there for the same reasons the company would. But the company's concern is not letting them get too close, to what they're doing. So great idea, great team. What was the other thing they do? Yeah, I think I think it's mostly, I would say, a lack of focus, which is related to trying to do too much out of the blocks. So again, even the best people and the best technologies, these things are hard to do. And I think you really have to sort of gate it and make sure that you're putting enough focus on critical things and not trying to go too broad. And the breadth also speaks to money, because breadth usually also, it's focus issue, but it's also a capital issue. And so you can get ahead of yourself in terms of your spending versus the value you're creating. So you can raise a $30 million Series A and done too much, so you haven't actually created $30 million of value. So when you go out to raise money the next time, people don't want to say it's worth $30 million or $40 million. You're going to say, really, this looks like the thing I just looked at down the street that was worth $10 million. And that's painful. But it's usually the focus, I would say. And again, look, and these things are always harder than you think. I haven't found one yet right? That isn't harder than you think. And no matter how much you think it through, you have to leave capacity to deal with the unexpected, and you can only do that if you have enough resource behind the appropriate number of things. Yep. Thank you.